The wind howled through the mountain pass, a living thing that clawed at exposed skin and turned breath into frozen clouds. It masked the sound of the bolts cycling, the mechanical click-snap of death being prepared. But it couldn't drown out the static in the earpiece. The tiny voice from 4,000 meters away, safe in an air-conditioned room where the war was just pixels on a screen. Do not engage, Sierra 1. I repeat, do not engage. That is a civilian structure. Corporal Kieran Vance lay prone on the cliff ledge, her right shoulder a constellation of agony where the joint had torn free from its socket. The world had been reduced to mathematics and will, barometric pressure, spindrift, the erratic hammering of her own heart against cracked ribs. Below in the valley where Team Echo was pinned, the sound of automatic weapons fire created a rhythm older than civilization itself. Negative, Command. I have positive ID on target. He's using the children as heat shields. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible over the wind. Through the jury-rigged thermal optic duct taped to her rifle, she watched the heat signatures bloom and fade, white-hot bodies pressed against cooling mud walls. If he reaches that ridge, Echo is dead. All of them. Stand down, Corporal. That is a direct order. If you take that shot and miss, or if you hit a collateral, you will face a court-martial before your boots touch American soil. Beside her position, somewhere down in the chaos of the wadi, Master Chief Thaddeus Brennan was bleeding out. She'd heard him on the radio 30 minutes ago, his voice wet and thick, asking for a status update he already knew the answer to. The man who'd seen something in a 19-year-old girl from the poorest county in West Virginia. The man who'd given her a chance when everyone else saw only a liability. You have 10 seconds, Vance. A different voice now, younger, desperate. Wyatt Hollis, call sign Tex, the team sniper who'd mocked her at the range just 72 hours ago. Make the call. Kieran's finger hovered over the trigger. The physics were impossible. A 1,200-meter shot at a 40-degree angle with variable winds and a scope held together by silver tape and prayer. The ethics were worse. 3 children huddled in front of the man with the RPG launcher. 3 small bodies that registered on thermal as brilliant white against the gray stone. Her father's voice echoed in memory from a different mountain range, a different life. Not Vietnam, not war, just the Appalachian ridges where he taught her to read wind and hold steady. The shot you don't take haunts you just as much as the one you do, girl. Maybe more. Dalton Vance had never been a soldier. He'd been a hunter, a guide, a man who understood mountains and the creatures that lived on them. Until the economy collapsed in 2009 and took their livelihood with it. Until depression became a weight too heavy to carry. Until a note and a single gunshot left 16-year-old Kieran alone with questions that had no answers. I'm sorry, Kieran whispered, not to Command, not to the voice screaming orders from safety, not even to Tex, who would die if she hesitated. She whispered it to the girl she used to be, the one who believed in clean choices and righteous wars. Click. 72 hours earlier. Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan. The heat at Bagram was physical, a heavy wool blanket soaked in kerosene and lit on fire. It rose from the tarmac in shimmering waves that distorted reality, turning distant aircraft into liquid mirages that danced and reformed. The smell was diesel fuel and burning trash, a combination that settled in the sinuses and stayed there, a permanent reminder of where you were and how far from home. For a sniper, mirage was information. It told you wind speed, thermal layers, the invisible architecture of the air through which your bullet would fly. For everyone else, it was just another reason to hate this place. Corporal Kieran Needle Vance lay prone in the pale dust of the qualification range, her cheek welded to the stock of a Macmillan TAC-50. The rifle was ridiculous next to her small frame, a 26-pound monster of steel and carbon fiber that looked like it belonged mounted on a vehicle, not cradled by a woman who barely cleared 5'4" and weighed 120, soaking wet. Like a child trying to play a cello designed for giants. "Hey, sweetheart," the voice came from behind, gravelly with tobacco and condescension. "You sure the recoil on that cannon isn't going to snap your collarbone?" Kieran didn't blink. She didn't move. Her world was the circular image inside her scope, a tunnel of enhanced reality where only the target existed. She focused on her breathing, the technique her father had taught her on those West Virginia ridges. Inhale for 4 counts, pause for 2, exhale for 4, pause for 2. The heartbeat slowed, the crosshairs steadied. "I'm talking to you, Alice." The voice belonged to Operator Jackson Calhoun, call sign Breaker, 6'3" of muscle and beard, lead breacher for SEAL Team Echo. He stood with his arms crossed, flanked by 3 other Tier 1 operators. They weren't wearing helmets. They wore baseball caps and Oakley sunglasses, radiating an aura of untouchable arrogance that came from being the best at what they did and knowing it. "Leave her be, Breaker." Another voice, this one tired, weighted with authority. Master Chief Thaddeus Brennan. He sounded like a man who'd run out of patience for petty dominance games somewhere around his 3rd combat deployment. "Command says she's our long gun for the Hindu Kush op. Let the kid zero her weapon." "She's 19, Chief." Breaker spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, a brown arc that landed 2 feet from Kieran's boot. 19. I have boots older than her. And she's supposed to cover our 6? It's a joke. Some diversity quota form got checked at the Pentagon, and now we're babysitting. Kieran adjusted the elevation turret. Click, click, 2 minutes of angle. The tactile feedback was the only thing that felt real in this superheated hallucination of a country. The metal was hot enough to burn skin, but she didn't flinch. "Range is clear." The range safety officer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, bored and mechanical. "Target deck is hot, 1,000 meters, steel plate." A lanky man with a sun-bleached mustache stepped up to the firing line beside Kieran. Petty Officer Wyatt Hollis, call sign Tex, the team's designated marksman. He carried an SR-25, a beautiful piece of engineering that looked almost delicate compared to the anti-materiel beast Kieran was wrestling. He settled onto the mat next to her with the easy confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Don't worry, darling." His accent was pure hill country Texas, every word stretched like taffy. "I'll handle the heavy lifting. Just try not to flag us with that barrel when you give up." Tex fired. The crack of the 7.62 round was sharp, clean. A second later, a puff of dirt kicked up 5 feet to the left of the steel target, a small explosion of pale dust that hung in the superheated air. "Wind's weird up here," Tex grumbled, his eyes still pressed to the scope. He reached up and adjusted his windage dial. "Kestrel says 5 miles per hour from the east, but it's pushing hard." He fired again. This time the miss was to the right, another mushroom cloud of failure blooming in the middle distance. "Variable gusts," Master Chief Brennan noted, his arms still crossed. He was watching the range with the intensity of a man who knew that in 72 hours, these shots would be taken at human beings who could shoot back. "Heat thermals coming off the runway. Tricky read." Kieran watched the mirage through her scope. She didn't look at the flags hanging limp in the dead air. She didn't consult the Kestrel weather meter clipped to her vest. She looked at the way the heat waves boiled through the magnified image, the way they rose and fell in patterns that spoke a language older than meteorology. The boil wasn't moving left or right, it was lifting, a vertical column of superheated air rising from the valley floor as the sun hammered the dark tarmac. A thermal updraft. The crosswind was an illusion, a localized eddy created by the runway infrastructure. If you dialed for windage, you'd miss every time. The real demon was vertical. "Hey, Vance," Breaker's voice carried across the range, laden with amusement. "Why don't you pack it up? Tex will dial it in eventually. Save the taxpayer the ammo cost. I'm sure there's paperwork somewhere with your name on it." Kieran ignored him. She closed her eyes for a split second, visualizing the bullet's flight path. Muzzle velocity 2,700 feet per second. Time of flight at 1,000 meters, approximately 1.3 seconds. In that time, gravity would pull the bullet down, but the updraft would push it high. She needed to hold under, not over. Counterintuitive. Trust the physics, not the instinct. She opened her eyes, exhaled until her lungs were empty, until she was a vacuum. The pause between heartbeats stretched into infinity. The trigger brake was crisp, like snapping a glass rod. Boom! The recoil of the .50 caliber slammed into her shoulder with the force of a linebacker doing a full sprint tackle. The muzzle brake vented burning gas to the sides, a percussion wave that kicked up a cloud of dust around her position, momentarily blinding the SEALs standing behind her. The concussive force was so intense it could be felt in the chest cavity, a physical slap that made hearts skip. Clang! The sound of the bullet striking the steel plate at 1,000 meters drifted back 3 full seconds later, carried on the wind like a distant church bell. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of metal meeting metal at supersonic speeds. "Lucky shot," Tex muttered, though his voice had lost some of its swagger. Kieran didn't speak. She worked the bolt, a smooth mechanical motion that ejected the spent brass casing. It tumbled through the air, glinting gold in the harsh sunlight, and landed in the dust with a soft clink. She settled back into position, finding the natural point of aim, letting the rifle become an extension of her body. Boom! Clang! 2, Master Chief Brennan counted, his voice dropping an octave. His arms had uncrossed. He was leaning forward now, focused. Boom! Clang! 3. The word came out quiet, almost reverent. Center mass, every time. Kieran engaged the safety with her thumb, a practiced motion. She pushed herself up from the dust, her body protesting the shift from prone to kneeling. She didn't smile. She didn't look for approval or acknowledgement. She grabbed her green notebook from her pack and began logging the atmospheric data in pencil, neat block letters that wouldn't smear in the heat. Temperature, 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure, 25.4 inches. Wind, variable gusts. Thermal updraft, approximately 2 MOA vertical. Holdover, negative -0.6 mils. She stood, brushing the grit from her uniform with brisk, efficient movements. The SEAL team was silent. Tex was staring at his kestrel, his brow furrowed like a student who just failed a test he thought he'd aced. Breaker looked like he'd swallowed something bitter and couldn't spit it out. "The wind isn't pushing east," Kieran said softly. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion or ego. She looked directly at Tex, then shifted her gaze to Brennan. "It's a thermal updraft from the runway. If you dial windage, you'll miss every time. You need to hold under, not over." She slung the rifle over her shoulder as if it were a day pack, the weight distributed across her back with the ease of long practice. Her frame was small, but her shoulders were corded with the lean muscle of someone who'd spent their childhood hauling firewood up mountain trails and field dressing deer in November cold. "Corporal Vance," Master Chief Brennan stepped into her path, his bulk blocking the sun and casting her in shadow. The mockery was gone from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating assessment. He was looking at her the way a jeweler examines a diamond, searching for flaws and value in equal measure. "Where did you learn to read trace like that?" "Appalachia, Master Chief," Kieran replied, adjusting her cap against the glare. "Hunting groundhogs across the valley back home. They're smaller than insurgents, and they don't shoot back." She walked past them toward the barracks, her boots crunching in the gravel. She could feel their eyes on her back, the weight of their stares like a physical presence. No longer scoffing, but heavy with a different kind of pressure. Doubt had been replaced by something more dangerous. Expectation. They expected a miracle now. They expected her to perform under stress, what she'd just done in controlled conditions. And in the mountains where they were going, where the air was thin and the enemy was smart, and the mistakes were measured in body bags, miracles were in short supply. The easy part was over. The shooting was just mathematics. The war, she knew, would be entirely different. The inside of an MH-47G Chinook helicopter does not smell like courage or glory or any of the things they put in recruiting commercials. It smells of hydraulic fluid, stale sweat, and the acrid exhaust that seeps through the open ramp despite the best efforts of the filtration systems. It is a vibrating metal coffin designed to vomit violence onto the earth and then flee before the earth can respond in kind. Kieran sat near the tail ramp, her knees pulled tight to her chest, trying to make herself small in a space that felt designed for men twice her size. The massive twin rotors overhead churned the night air with a rhythmic thump, thump, thump that vibrated in the bones, in the teeth, in the soft tissue of the organs. The noise was absolute, a wall of sound that erased individual thought and reduced human beings to their most basic animal functions. Breathe, survive, obey. Around her, the men of SEAL Team Echo were statues carved from modern warfare. They sat in their kit, dressed in multicam that turned them into extensions of the landscape they were about to assault. Their faces were obscured by ballistic mandibles and the four-tubed spider eyes of their GP-NVG-18 night vision goggles, making them look like insects from some apocalyptic future. They checked their weapons with fluid, muscular precision. Breaker was taping a chem light to his shoulder rig. Tex was rechecking the seating of his magazines for the third time, a nervous habit disguised as professionalism. They were a single organism, breathing in sync, moving as one. Kieran was the foreign body, the outlier, the variable that didn't fit the equation. Vance! Master Chief Brennan's voice crackled over the ICS, the internal communication system that turned human speech into compressed digital packets. When the ramp drops, you are last out. You stay on my 6. Do not deviate. Do not hunt. You are luggage until I say otherwise. Copy? Kieran pressed the push-to-talk button on her chest rig, the plastic slick under her gloved fingers. Solid copy, Chief. The word luggage sat in her stomach like a stone. She felt the heat rise in her neck, a flush of anger and shame that she forced down through sheer will. Brennan was protecting her. Or perhaps he was protecting his team from her inexperience. Either way, by putting her in the rear, he was blinding the only person in the squad who was trained to see what machines and men might miss. The crew chief, a gunner manning the M134 minigun on the starboard window, held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes to insertion. The Chinook banked hard, a violent maneuver that pressed Kieran into the nylon webbing of her seat. The G-force pushed the blood into her legs, made her vision gray at the edges. They were flying nap of the earth, contour chasing at 50 feet above the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, using the terrain to stay under radar coverage. Outside the open ramp, the mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky, silhouettes of violence waiting to happen. Kieran reached up and flipped her night vision goggles down. The interior of the helicopter exploded into crisp, blue-white phosphor clarity. She could see the expressions on the operators' faces now, or at least the parts not covered by gear. Tex was breathing through his mouth, rapid, shallow breaths. Breaker was perfectly still, a Buddha of violence waiting to be unleashed. LZ coming up, the pilot announced, his voice as calm as if he were ordering coffee. Sensors reading cold, no heat signatures. We are green for insertion. Copy, Brennan replied. Maintain profile. Kieran unbuckled her safety belt, timing the motion with the others. She shuffled toward the rear ramp on her knees, trying to get a view of the ground rushing up to meet them. The team was stacking up in front of her, blocking her view with their bulk and their gear. She shifted her weight, craning her neck, peering through the small gap between Breaker's shoulder and the fuselage wall. The ground below was a monochromatic wash of white and gray through the night vision. The landing zone was a flat plateau overlooking a valley, barren and exposed. It looked empty, But Kieran's eyes were hypersensitive to contrast, trained through thousands of hours to see what others missed. She blinked, focusing on a patch of ground about 10 meters from the center of the designated LZ. It wasn't a body. Bodies glowed bright white on thermal, hot spots of metabolic heat against the cold earth. This was subtle, barely there. A patch of ground that was slightly darker than the surrounding rock, a difference of maybe 2 degrees. Disturbed earth. When soil is turned over, when it's freshly dug and then replaced, it loses heat faster than the packed dirt around it. The temperature differential is tiny, but measurable. Someone had been digging there. Recently. "Pilot, hold!" Kieran shouted into the comms, her voice cracking with the strain of speaking over the rotor noise and the G-forces. "Pilot, abort approach!" The channel went dead silent for a microsecond, a void that felt like falling. "Who is that?" the pilot snapped, confusion and anger mixing in equal measure. "Say again?" "Rear element," Kieran said, speaking fast, forcing the words out before Brennan could cut her off or countermand. "I have a soil anomaly at 3 o'clock, 10 meters from the landing spot. Possible IED emplacement. It's disturbed earth, not natural erosion. The thermal signature is wrong." "I'm reading nothing on thermal. Rear element," the pilot argued, his voice tight. They were 30 seconds from touchdown, committed to the approach vector. "Sensors are clear. We are 30 seconds from wheels down." "It's there," Kieran insisted, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that threatened to crack bone. "Chief, it's there. The earth is colder than ambient. Someone dug there within the last 6 hours." If she was wrong, she was the hysterical teenage girl who delayed a Tier 1 operation based on paranoia. If she was right, shift the LZ 50 meters north. Brennan's voice cut through the chaos, hard and decisive. "Do it. Now." "Belay that," the pilot started. "Shift it," Kieran screamed, breaking every protocol in the book, her voice raw with certainty. The helicopter lurched violently as the pilot instinctively reacted to the urgency in her voice, the primal recognition of genuine fear. The massive beast flared, the nose tilting up, the engines screaming in protest as physics and aerodynamics fought for dominance. The maneuver threw the seals off balance. Breaker slammed into the bulkhead with a grunt. Tex grabbed a cargo strap to keep from tumbling. The wheels touched down on rocky scree 50 meters north of the original mark, the impact jarring enough to rattle teeth. Dust and small stones kicked up in a violent cloud. "Ramp down, go, go, go," the crew chief roared. The SEALs surged forward like water released from a dam, sprinting down the ramp into the swirling dust cloud. Weapons raised, they fanned out into a defensive perimeter, each man taking a sector, creating a 360-degree bubble of lethal coverage. Kieran scrambled after them, her heavy rifle banging against her thighs, the weight throwing off her balance. She hit the dirt next to Brennan, her knees slamming into rock hard enough to bruise through the knee pads. The Chinook didn't linger. The pilot pulled power immediately, the engines winding up to a scream, the rotors beating the air into submission. The helicopter lifted off, blasting them with a hurricane of grit and noise before vanishing into the night sky like a ghost. Silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. The kind of silence that exists only in wild places, where human noise is an intrusion and nature waits with infinite patience. Master Chief Brennan crawled over to Kieran, his movements fast and aggressive. He grabbed her shoulder strap and yanked her close, his face inches from hers. Through the night vision, his eyes glowed with an eerie green luminescence, like a predator in the dark. "You better have a damn good reason for overriding a flight warrant officer, Corporal," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper but loaded with the promise of consequences. "You almost compromised the bird and everyone on it." Kieran didn't respond. She pointed toward the original landing zone, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Watch the 3 o'clock, Chief." Brennan looked. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. The dust settled. The mountains watched. The stars burned cold and indifferent overhead. Then, a flash. It wasn't an explosion. It was a single, solitary trip flare. A magnesium bloom of white-hot light that lasted less than a second. The rotor wash from the departing Chinook had been just strong enough to disturb a tension wire stretched across the landing zone. But because they'd shifted north, the main pressure plate beneath the soil hadn't been triggered. The flare sputtered and died, but in that brief illumination they all saw it. A mound of dirt, carefully shaped and camouflaged, large enough to hide a 155mm artillery shell, the kind that could turn an armored vehicle into confetti and vaporize human beings into pink mist. If they had landed there, if the Chinook's landing gear had pressed down on that earth, the heat of the engines and the weight of the aircraft would have triggered the primary charge. The helicopter and everyone inside would have ceased to exist in a fraction of a second, turned into scattered atoms in a brief, bright spot on some distant satellite feed. The flare died out. Darkness returned, absolute and final. Brennan stared at the spot for a long moment. He didn't say anything. He didn't apologize or congratulate. He simply looked back at Kieran, and even through the distortion of night vision and tactical gear, she saw the way his grip on his rifle changed. The tension in his shoulders shifted. The way he held himself in relation to her altered by degrees. "We're being watched," Breaker's voice came over the team radio, low and tight with controlled aggression. That was a command-detonated setup. They knew we were coming. They knew where we'd land. Kieran scanned the ridgeline 1,200 meters above them, the dark, jagged teeth of the mountains cutting into the starfield. The air was thin up here, cold, smelling of dry sage and something else, something predatory. She adjusted the focus on her monocular, sweeping slowly across the high ground. There, a single glint, a reflection of starlight on glass. It lasted for a fraction of a second, less than a heartbeat, then vanished. Someone up there had just closed a lens cover on an optic. Someone had been watching through a scope and had just gone dark. "They're waiting for us," Kieran said, her voice steady now. The fear transformed into something colder and more useful. "Ridgeline, 12 o'clock high. I saw a lens reflection. They're up there." "Move out," Brennan ordered, his voice devoid of the earlier condescension. The dynamic had shifted in ways that couldn't be undone. "Vance, you take second position right behind point. Keep your eyes open. You just saved our lives. Don't stop now." She wasn't luggage anymore. She was the early warning system, and the warning light was flashing red. The Hindu Kush didn't care about elite training or billion-dollar budgets or the trident pinned to a warrior's chest. The mountains were a physical absolute, a vertical wall of granite and thin air that demanded a toll for every step forward, every breath taken at 8,000 feet, where oxygen was a luxury and exhaustion came fast. 2 hours into the patrol, the adrenaline from the near miss at the landing zone had burned off completely, leaving behind the cold, grinding reality of movement through hostile terrain. They were navigating what the maps called a green zone, though the term was a cruel joke in the moonlight. It was a strip of agricultural land hugging a dried riverbed, a tangle of irrigation ditches and waist-high stone walls, and scrub brush that offered 1,000 places to die and nowhere to hide from the high ground. Kieran was suffering in ways that didn't show on her face. The TAC-50 was not designed for patrolling. With her day pack, ammunition, ceramic plates, and the rifle itself, she was humping nearly half her body weight. Her lungs burned in the thin atmosphere, each breath a conscious effort that didn't quite satisfy the oxygen debt building in her muscles. But while the SEALs were built for explosive violence, fast-twitch muscle fibers designed for door-kicking and close-quarters battle, Kieran was built for endurance. She was Appalachian tough, raised on ridgelines where you walk 6 miles just to check a fence line, where carrying a deer quarter out of a hollow was expected by age 12. Her legs were lean cables of slow-twitch fiber. Her cardiovascular system adapted to sustained effort, over hours and days. She kept pace. Her breath hissed rhythmically through her nose, a measured cadence that matched her footfalls. Her eyes never stopped scanning, never settled on a single point. The world through night vision was a landscape of shadows and highlights, and somewhere in that monochrome hell, people were waiting to kill them. "Pick it up, rear," Breaker's voice whispered over the comms. He was 50 meters ahead, moving like a shadow given purpose and direction. "Maintain interval," Brennan corrected, his voice tight with tension. "Vance, what are you seeing?" Kieran panned her thermal monocular across the canyon walls towering above them. The sheer cliffs were a sniper's paradise, offering elevation, concealment, and multiple egress routes. The geometry of the kill zone was perfect, textbook even. The valley floor was a funnel, and they were walking directly into the narrow end. "Too many angles, Chief," Kieran murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is a natural ambush site. If they engage us here, we have no cover except the ditches. We're channelized." "We're ghosting, Vance," Breaker said, though his confidence sounded thinner than before, more wish than certainty. "They don't know we're here. We're invisible." Kieran paused mid-step, dropping to one knee. The sudden halt caused the operator behind her to bump into her boot with a muffled curse. She ignored him, focusing instead on a cluster of rocks about 600 meters up the north face of the valley. Through thermal, everything was shades of gray and white, hot and cold rendered in digital clarity. To an untrained eye, the rocks were just rocks, a natural scree field of loose debris that had tumbled down from the cliff face over centuries. But Kieran's eyes were not untrained. She'd spent her childhood learning to read the Appalachian wilderness, where survival depended on seeing what didn't belong. Nature was chaos, true, but chaos had patterns. Randomness followed rules. Near the base of a jagged outcropping, the shadows formed a straight line. Not curved, not organic, straight. A slit, maybe 8 inches wide and 3 feet long. A loophole. "Halt," Kieran whispered into the comms, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Visual on possible hide site. North face, elevation 600 meters. The column froze instantly. 12 operators melted into the brush like they'd never been there at all, weapons snapping up toward the ridgeline in perfect synchronization. Brennan crawled up beside Kieran, his movements economical and silent despite his bulk. "Talk to me." "Sector 4, Kieran said, pointing with a gloved hand, keeping the gesture small and controlled. "Just below that shelf. The rock pile is artificial. Someone stacked those stones. It's a prepared fighting position, Chief. A loophole." Brennan pulled out his own spotting scope, a high-end optic worth more than Kieran's annual salary. He switched to thermal imaging and stared at the spot for 30 seconds. The wind whistled through the valley, rattling the dry corn stalks near the riverbed, a sound like bones clicking together. "I've got nothing on thermal," Brennan said finally, lowering the scope. His voice was measured, professional. "Cold rock. If someone was in there, we'd see a heat bloom from body warmth or exhalation vapor. It's below freezing up there." "They could be using a thermal blanket," Kieran argued, hearing the edge creep into her voice despite her effort to stay calm. "Or they're deep inside a cave system. Chief, that is a prepared fighting position. The angles are perfect. It faces directly down into this choke point." Brennan checked his wrist-mounted Garmin, the blue glow of the screen reflecting off his goggles. "We are 20 minutes behind timeline. If we don't hit the compound before 0400, we lose the element of surprise. We can't clear every suspicious shadow in these mountains, Vance. We'd be here until the snow flies." "It's not a shadow," Kieran insisted, the frustration building in her chest like pressure behind a dam. The intuition that had saved them at the landing zone was screaming at her again, a primal warning system that bypassed conscious thought. "If we walk past it, they'll have our backs." Brennan looked at her, then up at the dark cliffs looming over them. The conflict in his eyes was visible even through the green glow of night vision. He was a hammer, designed to strike hard and fast and overwhelming. She was trying to tell him not to swing, to wait, to reconsider. It went against every instinct in his body. "Breaker," Brennan radioed, making his decision. "Scan the ridge with thermals. Full sweep, sector 3 through 6. "Clear, boss," Breaker replied almost instantly. The big operator's voice was confident, dismissive even. "No heat signatures, nothing moving. Let's push. We're sitting ducks out here." Brennan turned back to Kieran. His jaw was set, the decision already made. "We push forward. Keep an eye on it, but we are not stopping." "That's an order." "Acknowledge." Kieran swallowed the protest rising in her throat. "Copy, Chief." They moved out, boots crunching softly on gravel. Kieran walked with her body turned slightly sideways, an awkward, shuffling gait that kept her rifle pointed forward, but her eyes fixed on that dark slit in the rocks. The position felt wrong in her bones, like walking past an open door in a dangerous neighborhood. Every step increased the distance, changed the angles, made them more vulnerable. She waited for the muzzle flash. She waited for the crack of a bullet breaking the sound barrier, the impact that would end her life before her brain could process what had happened. It didn't come. 30 minutes later, the silhouette of the village emerged from the darkness, like a ship materializing from fog. It was a cluster of mud brick compounds surrounded by high walls, structures that looked medieval in their construction. The architecture hadn't changed in 500 years because it didn't need to. Thick walls kept the heat in during winter and out during summer. Flat roofs provided sleeping space when the interiors became unbearable. It was functional, permanent, and imposing. "Stack up," Brennan ordered, his voice shifting to the clipped cadence of immediate action. The team transitioned from patrol mode to close quarters battle in seconds, movements becoming fluid and economical. They approached the main gate of the target compound in a tactical column, each man covering a different angle, creating overlapping fields of fire. Breaker placed a kinetic charge on the lock, a small explosive device designed to defeat the mechanism without bringing down the entire structure. He stepped back, made a hand signal, and pressed the detonator. Thump. The sound was muffled, almost polite, but the effect was absolute. The heavy wooden gate swung inward, smoke curling from the destroyed lock mechanism. "Go, go, go!" The SEALs flooded into the courtyard like water finding cracks. Lasers from their weapon-mounted IR illuminators sweeping every corner in synchronized patterns. The beams were invisible to the naked eye, but brilliant through night vision, creating a web of lines that carved the darkness into manageable sectors. "Clear left! Clear right! Room 1, clear." Kieran entered last, her role to hold the perimeter while the assault element cleared the interior. She expected shouting, gunfire, the chaos of close-quarters combat. Instead, there was only the sound of boots on packed earth and the controlled breathing of operators doing their job. "Building is clear," Breaker announced, his voice thick with confusion and frustration. "It's empty. No HVT, no guards, no weapons cache, nothing." Brennan walked into the center of the main room, his weapon lowered but ready. It was a simple living space, exactly what you'd expect in a rural Afghan compound. Rugs on the floor, cushions scattered around the perimeter, a low table in the corner. Everything neat, orderly, lived in. "Intel was solid," Brennan growled, the anger evident despite his controlled tone. "He was supposed to be here. Tonight." "We had 3 separate sources confirm." Kieran walked past him into the small kitchen area, drawn by something she couldn't name. The air smelled of cardamom and wet wool, scents that seemed out of place in this landscape of dust and stone. She felt a strange warmth emanating from the corner, a heat signature that didn't match the ambient temperature. On a low table sat a silver tea kettle, ornate and well-maintained, sitting on a small serving tray with 2 glasses. Kieran reached out slowly, holding her hands 6 inches above the kettle. The heat radiating from the metal was unmistakable, intense enough to feel through her glove. She grabbed a glass and tilted the kettle, pouring a small amount of liquid onto the packed earth floor. Steam rose up immediately, swirling in the cold air like a living thing, twisting and curling before dissipating. "Chief," Kieran said, her voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through the silence like a blade. "You need to see this." Brennan turned, saw the steam rising from the wet spot on the floor. He froze, his entire body going rigid as the implications crashed through his tactical mind like a freight train through a paper wall. "They didn't just leave," Kieran said, looking around the room with new eyes, feeling the presence of watchers she couldn't see. "They left 5 minutes ago. When we stopped to look at the ridge, the hide site you spotted," Brennan realized, the color draining from his face despite the darkness. "It was a spotter position. They radioed ahead while we were staring at their nest." "We're not the hunters," Kieran said softly, the certainty settling over her like a shroud. She could feel it now, the weight of eyes on them, the sensation of being observed by malevolent intelligence. "We're the bait." Whoosh! The sound was unmistakable, a noise that every infantry soldier learns to fear. It was the sound of air being displaced by a rocket-propelled grenade, the whistle of physics and explosive chemistry hurtling toward flesh and bone. "Incoming!" Breaker screamed. The world turned white. The explosion did not sound like a movie sound effect. It was not a boom or a bang. It was a physical slap, a violent displacement of air that punched the breath from Kieran's lungs before her brain could register the noise. The RPG impacted the compound wall in a shower of razor-sharp shale and burning chemical residue. The overpressure wave picked her up like a child's toy and threw her backward. Kieran's body skidded across the hard-packed dirt, her head bouncing once, twice, stars exploding behind her eyes. Her ears rang with a high-pitched squeal that drowned out everything else. A tinnitus so intense it felt like her eardrums had been punctured. For 3 seconds she was blind, her vision completely obscured by dust so thick it was like swimming through concrete. Then the sound returned, not gradually but all at once, a wall of noise that threatened to overwhelm her senses. It wasn't the heroic shouting of orders from war movies. It was the terrifying, rhythmic chatter of heavy machine guns echoing off the canyon walls, the sound of industrial violence being applied with mechanical precision. "Contact front! Elevation!" The scream came from everywhere and nowhere, multiple voices overlapping into a single cry of alarm and desperation. The SEALs, trained to react to contact with immediate and overwhelming aggression, poured suppressive fire toward the ridgeline. Their rifles made sharp cracking sounds, the reports of suppressed weapons that sounded like staple guns compared to the roaring thunder of the enemy's unsuppressed PKM machine guns. Green tracers slashed through the dust, hammering the ground around them, each round capable of punching through body armor and liquefying internal organs. Kieran scrambled to her knees, coughing up grit, her mouth tasting of copper and dust. She was in the kill box, a pre-registered target zone where the enemy had calculated exact ranges and angles. The courtyard was a bowl, and the shooters on the cliffs were looking down into it, like gods deciding which ants to step on. "Get inside! Get to hard cover!" Brennan's voice cut through the chaos, raw and desperate, stripped of the professional calm that usually defined him. Kieran grabbed her rifle, dragging the heavy case toward her body. She tried to move toward the main building where the team was funneling, but the doorway was a fatal funnel. Rounds were chewing up the doorframe, splinters of wood and chunks of mud brick exploding outward in deadly shrapnel clouds. "Man down! Breaker is down!" Through the swirling dust, Kieran saw the massive shape of Jackson Calhoun collapse, his right leg suddenly a ruin of shredded fabric and blood. 2 operators grabbed his drag handle, hauling him backward into the structure, while a third laid down a wall of suppressive fire with a MK-48 machine gun, the weapon bucking in his hands as he walked the impacts across the ridgeline. Kieran stood to follow, to cover the 5 meters between her position and safety, but a line of machine gun fire stitched across the ground directly in front of her boots. The impacts were so close she felt the heat of the rounds passing, the supersonic crack that snapped the air like a whip. If she tried to cross that gap, she would be cut in half. "Vance, move!" Brennan screamed from the darkness of the doorway, his voice cracking with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. Fear. She looked at him, then at the tracers tearing up the threshold. The math was simple and brutal. 5 meters might as well be 5 miles. "I can't," she yelled back, though she doubted he could hear her over the cacophony. Another RPG shrieked down from the cliffs, the contrail visible against the stars. It impacted the roof of the main building, collapsing part of the overhang in a shower of timber and clay tiles. The shockwave knocked Kieran sideways, rolling her toward the outer perimeter wall like a piece of debris in a hurricane. She didn't fight the momentum. She rolled with it, her body tumbling over rough ground until she slammed into the shadows of a small animal pen attached to the outer wall. It was a low structure, roofed with corrugated tin and filled with dry straw. The smell of ammonia and old goat dung was overwhelming, a stench that burned the sinuses and made breathing an active punishment. She lay flat, pressing her face into the filthy dirt. Inside the main building, she could hear the SEALs shouting, calling for a medic, calling for air support. But outside in the courtyard, the enemy fire was relentless, a constant drumbeat of death designed to keep anyone from moving, from thinking, from doing anything except dying. Kieran checked herself with shaking hands. Her fingers explored her body armor, her limbs, searching for the wet warmth that would indicate a wound. Nothing. Somehow, impossibly, she was intact. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the massive adrenaline dump flooding her system, her body's chemical response to mortal terror. She used her father's breathing technique, forcing her heart rate down. Her hands steadied. The ringing in her ears faded to a dull hum beneath the gunfire. She was alone, separated from the team by 5 meters of space that might as well be the surface of Mars. The only thing between her and 50 enemy fighters was a mud brick wall in the darkness. She pulled her rifle close, checking the optic with trembling fingers. The lens was dusty but intact, no cracks in the glass that would make the weapon useless. "Command, this is Echo Actual." Brennan's voice crackled in her earpiece, strained and tight. "We are pinned down, taking heavy fire from high ground. We have one urgent surgical, possible arterial bleed. Requesting immediate close air support." "How copy?" "Echo Actual. This is Havoc." The response came back with maddening calm, the voice of someone safe in a tactical operations center hundreds of miles away. "Negative on close air support. We have no assets on station for 20 mics. You are on your own. Recommend you dig in and wait for extraction window. How copy?" 20 minutes. Brennan's voice when he responded was barely controlled rage. "We'll be dead in 10. Kieran shifted her position, moving with glacial slowness to avoid drawing attention. Through a gap in the rotting wood of the animal pen, she looked up at the cliffs. The enemy thought they'd won. They thought the Americans were all huddled in the main building, waiting to be killed or surrender. They didn't know one was outside, alone, with a rifle that could reach out and touch someone at distances they thought were safe. High up on the ridge, she saw them again through her thermal monocular. The heat signatures she'd spotted earlier were now multiple, bright white blooms against the cold gray stone. They were standing up, comfortable, firing down with impunity. They thought they were untouchable at 1,200 meters, too far for the SEALs' carbines to be effective. The angle too steep for return fire to be accurate. They were wrong. Kieran extended the bipod legs of her TAC-50 with slow, deliberate movements. She pushed the muzzle through a gap in the wooden slats, the barrel just barely protruding into the open air. The physics of the shot flooded her mind like a dam breaking. Angle of inclination, 35 degrees. Coriolis effect negligible at this range, but not zero. Spin drift approximately 0.2 mils. The bullet would drop, but because she was shooting upward at such a steep angle, gravity would have less effect on the trajectory than a level shot. Counterintuitive, she had to aim low, not high. She wasn't a soldier in that moment. She wasn't a teenage girl from West Virginia. She became the platform, the biological computer processing a firing solution that most people couldn't comprehend even with a calculator in unlimited time. "Echo Actual, this is Vance," she whispered, pressing the comms button on her chest rig. "I'm outside the building. I'm in the sheep pen on the east wall." "Vance, where the hell are you?" Brennan sounded relieved and furious in equal measure, emotions bleeding through despite his training. "Get back inside. You're exposed." "If I move, I die," she said simply, the truth stripped of emotion or drama. "And if I don't start shooting, you die. I have an angle on the ridge." She didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask for orders. The rules of engagement were clear: self-defense and defense of friendly forces. This was both. She settled the crosshairs on the brightest heat signature on the cliff face, a PKM gunner who was currently raining death onto the roof where Brennan and his team were cowering. The man was standing fully upright, silhouetted against the stars, confident in his invulnerability. Kieran exhaled, letting the air leave her lungs until she was empty, until she was nothing but bone and will and purpose. The pause between heartbeats stretched into forever. The world stopped. Crack! The recoil pushed her back into the straw, the buttstock slamming into her shoulder with enough force to leave a bruise that would turn purple and black within hours. The report of the .50 caliber was thunderous in the confined space, a noise so loud it was physical, a pressure wave that made the corrugated tin roof vibrate. But 1,200 meters away, the physics of violence arrived before the sound. The PKM gunner simply ceased to exist. One moment he was a heat signature, the next he was a cooling spray of biological matter painted across the rocks. The machine gun fell silent, clattering down the cliff face. For one heartbeat, the battlefield held its breath. Then the fire shifted. The tracers that had been hammering the main building swung toward the sheep pen like the eye of an angry god. The enemy hadn't expected a counterpunch of that magnitude, hadn't expected someone to reach out and touch them at that distance. But now they knew. Now they understood. Kieran racked the bolt, the massive brass casing ejecting from the chamber and landing in the straw beside her face. It was still hot, searing her cheek where it touched skin. She wasn't safe. She wasn't hidden. She was the only target that mattered now. "One down," she whispered to herself, to the ghost of her father, to whatever deity watched over fools and snipers. 49 to go. The sheep pen began to disintegrate around her, wood and metal shredding under the weight of concentrated fire. The world became splinters and screaming metal, and the absolute certainty that she had maybe 30 seconds before the structure collapsed completely and left her exposed. 30 seconds to live or die by mathematics and will. She settled the crosshairs on the next target and began to work. The sheep pen collapsed in stages, each support beam giving way with a sound like breaking bones. Kieran's concentrated return fire had made her the priority target, and the insurgents were determined to eliminate the threat. Rounds punched through the corrugated tin, through the wooden slats, through the very air she was breathing. "Vance, status!" Brennan's voice was a jagged tear in the static of her earpiece, barely audible over the cacophony. "Still here," she coughed, her mouth full of dust and the copper taste of fear. "Taking effective fire from multiple positions." "Displace!" "You need to displace from that location. Move." "Negative," Kieran whispered, knowing the truth even as she spoke it. "If I stand up, I'm dead in 2 seconds." The suppressive fire from the ridge was heavy but undisciplined. It was the spray and pray of adrenaline-fueled fighters, men who'd been surprised by her reach and were now trying to saturate her position with enough rounds to guarantee a kill. Kieran knew the rhythm of panic fire. It was erratic, wasteful, emotional. Danger in volume, but lacking precision. Then a new sound cut through the chaos. Not the sharp crack of AK-47s or the rapid chatter of PKM machine guns. This was different. A heavy, dull thud that she felt in her chest cavity more than heard with her ears. Thump. A split second later, there was a sickening crunch from the main building where the SEALs were trapped. The sound of something massive punching through solid matter. Thump. Crunch. "We're taking rounds inside," Brennan shouted over the comms, and for the first time since she'd met him, Kieran heard genuine panic bleeding into the Master Chief's voice. "They're punching through the north wall. Doc, get Breaker into the back room. Move! Move!" Kieran stared at the compound wall 20 meters away through a gap in the splintered wood. The holes appearing in the thick mud brick were neat, perfectly spaced, methodical. This wasn't random fire. Someone was systematically dismantling the team's cover, putting rounds through 18 inches of sun-baked clay to kill the men hiding behind it. Thump. A scream erupted from inside the building, raw and primal. "Hit! Tex is hit! He's hit through the damn wall!" Kieran's mind raced, processing information through the filter of her training. To punch through that much material and still retain enough energy to cause casualties, the shooter had to be using heavy caliber rounds, likely 338 Lapua Magnum or .50 BMG with armor-piercing cores. And he wasn't guessing at positions. He knew exactly where they were huddled inside. "Chief," Kieran said, her voice dropping to that eerie calm that descended when the math took over, when fear transformed into physics. "It's a sniper. He's wall-banging you. Long-range precision fire." "I know that," Brennan snapped, the strain evident in every syllable. "Where is he?" "I'm looking." Kieran slithered forward through the debris, pushing the muzzle of her TAC-50 through the wreckage. She ignored the tracers snapping over her head, ignored the splinters of wood embedding themselves in her sleeves. She had to find the ghost. She brought her eye to the scope, switching her thermal palette to black-hot mode. The ridge lit up with white-hot signatures of insurgents firing their AKs and machine guns. They were easy to see, glowing blobs of metabolic heat moving, shouting, expending energy in their excitement. But a sniper doesn't glow. A sniper is a void. A professional shooter minimizes movement, controls breathing, becomes part of the landscape. Finding one required looking for what wasn't there as much as what was. She scanned slowly, fighting the urge to rush, left to right, near to far. The insurgents were clustered on the lower shelf, about 800 meters away, but the heavy precision shots were coming from higher, much higher. She pushed the magnification to 25 power. The image jittered with the vibration of impacts around her position. She forced her breathing to stabilize, using the pause between heartbeats to steady the reticle. There, high on the crest, near a jagged spine of granite, there was nothing visible, no heat signature, no movement, but the air was wrong. To the high-end optics, she saw a faint distortion, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt in summer. But this wasn't body heat, it was something else. She watched, waited, and then she saw it again. Thump. The moment the heavy rifle fired, a tiny ripple of heat wavered in front of a dark fissure in the rocks. A suppressor traps the expanding gases from a gunshot, preventing the sound from escaping. But the metal tube gets hot, very hot. After multiple shots, even a wrapped suppressor creates a mirage, a thermal signature that appears as distorted air. This shooter had wrapped his barrel to minimize thermal bloom, but he couldn't hide physics. Every time he fired, the suppressor's heat signature pulsed like a heartbeat. "I see him," Kieran whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Call it," Brennan demanded, desperation making his voice sharp. "Elevation 1,200 meters. Reference the Twin Peaks at our 12 o'clock. Drop down 50 meters. There's a vertical fissure in the rock face. Deep shadow. He's shooting from inside a cave or crevice. Can you take the shot? Kieran adjusted her elevation turret with mechanical precision. Click, click, click. She ranged the target using her reticle's mil-dots. 1,250 meters. Angle of fire approximately 40 degrees upward. She had the distance. She had the wind hold. But as she centered the crosshairs on the fissure, reality crashed down on her like a physical weight. The fissure was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide at the opening. The enemy sniper wasn't sitting out in the open. He was deep inside, shooting through a loophole, a small opening just large enough for his barrel and scope. From her current position on the valley floor, she was looking up at an acute angle. She couldn't see into the hole. She could only see the rock face around it. The geometry was wrong. Negative, she said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. I have no angle. He's keyhole deep in the rock. I can't hit him from the valley floor. Thump. Damn it, Brennan cursed, the sound of something electronic shattering in the background. He just took out our SATCOM radio. Vance, if you don't kill him, he is going to pick us apart until there's nothing left to bury. We're pinned. We can't move. We can't call for help. You're the only chance we have. Kieran pulled her eye away from the scope. She looked at the sheer cliff face to her right, the eastern wall of the valley that rose up like a jagged tooth. It was nearly vertical, loose scree and fractured limestone. But there was a shelf about 300 meters up, a narrow ledge that jutted out from the main face. If she stayed here, she was relatively safe for the moment. The sheep pen was low priority for the enemy sniper. He wanted the seals, the high-value targets. But from that shelf, the angle would change. She would be able to look across the valley at a more horizontal trajectory. She might be able to see into the fissure. But to reach that shelf, she would have to climb. And climbing meant exposure. Every gun on the mountain would have a clear shot at her. I have to move, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone listening. Say again? Brennan asked. I can't take the shot from here, Chief, Kieran said, her voice firming with decision. The angle is wrong. I need elevation. I'm going up. Vance, do not leave cover. Brennan's order was sharp, absolute. The courtyard is a kill zone. You'll be cut down before you make 10 meters. I'm already dead if I stay here, Kieran replied with the simple logic of mathematics. The sheep pen was disintegrating. In another 2 minutes, there would be nothing left to hide behind. And you're dead if that sniper keeps shooting. She didn't wait for permission. She grabbed her rifle, checked that the magazine was seated properly, and took a breath that tasted of dust and destiny. She looked at the open ground between her position and the base of the cliff. 50 meters of death. Cover me, she whispered, knowing they couldn't, knowing she was asking for a miracle. Then she ran. The 50 meters between the sheep pen and the cliff face were the longest seconds of Kieran Vance's life. She didn't run like a soldier, trained and measured. She ran like prey, fast and low and desperate, every survival instinct screaming that this was suicide. The mountain erupted. The dirt around her boots geysered upward as rounds impacted, each one close enough that she felt the supersonic crack, the air being torn apart by metal moving faster than sound. The insurgents on the ridgeline adjusted their fire, tracking her movement, leading her path like hunters shooting at a running deer. She didn't look up. She didn't look back. She fixed her eyes on a dark fissure at the base of the cliff wall and threw every ounce of energy into closing the distance. A round tugged at her sleeve. Another kicked up dust so close to her face that she tasted rock powder. The suppressive fire from the compound intensified as the SEALs realized what she was doing and tried desperately to keep enemy heads down. Kieran hit the cliff face at full sprint and didn't slow. She threw herself into the narrow crevice, her momentum carrying her deep into the shadow. She slammed into the back wall, the impact driving the air from her lungs. She scrambled deeper, pressing her back against cold stone, gasping for oxygen that wouldn't come. Vance! Brennan's voice was frantic in her earpiece. Report! At the base, she wheezed, running her hands over her body, checking for wounds she couldn't feel through the adrenaline. Her fingers came away clean. No blood. Somehow, impossibly, she was intact. I'm at the base of the east cliff, starting the ascent. Vance, you're going to silhouette yourself against the sky, Brennan warned, his tactical mind seeing the problem even through his fear. If they see movement on that wall, every gun is going to track you. Then keep them busy, Kieran snapped, allowing herself a moment of anger to burn through the fear. She cut the channel before he could respond. She looked up. The cliff wasn't a clean granite face like the rock climbing walls she'd trained on. It was a chaotic mess of fractured sedimentary layers, shale and limestone that had been thrust upward millions of years ago and then weathered by wind and ice into a vertical maze. The shelf she needed to reach was 80 meters above her current position, a thin lip of rock that looked like it might collapse if you breathed on it wrong. She tightened the sling of her TAC-50, shifting the 26-pound rifle so it sat diagonally across her back. The weight immediately threw off her balance, pulling her backward. Every movement would require compensation for the mass trying to drag her off the rock. She reached up and found a handhold, a protruding knob of limestone that felt solid. She tested it with half her weight. It held. She pulled. The climb was a brutal exercise in physics and suffering. Every time she lifted her body weight, the rifle dug into her spine, the metal parts finding pressure points against vertebrae. The angle was what climbers called Class 4, steep enough to require hands, but not quite vertical enough to need ropes. But with 60 pounds of gear strapped to her body, it might as well have been a free solo of El Capitan. 10 meters up. 20. Her fingers ached, the cold making the rock feel like it was coated in ice. Below her, the battle continued, the sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls like thunder trapped in a jar. She could see the tracers crossing the valley, deadly light shows that meant men were dying. She focused on the rock in front of her face. 3 points of contact, always. Hand, foot, foot, move. Hand, hand, foot, move. The rhythm became meditation, a mantra of survival. At 40 meters up, disaster struck. She reached for a protruding slab of gray rock, testing it with light pressure. It felt solid, part of the main face. She committed her weight, pulling herself upward. Crack! The slab sheared off cleanly, breaking free from the cliff face with a sound like a gunshot. Kieran's right hand flew backward, grasping at empty air. Her body swung violently to the left, the weight of the rifle acting as a pendulum. Her left boot scraped uselessly against smooth stone. She was falling. Time dilated, the way it does in moments of extreme crisis. She saw the rock face rushing past, felt the sickening lurch in her stomach as gravity claimed her. Her fingers clawed desperately at the shale, tearing through her gloves, shredding her fingernails down to the quick. Her chest slammed into the cliff face. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs in an explosive gasp. Her fingers found purchase on something, anything, a tiny ledge barely deep enough for the first joint of her fingers. Her descent stopped with a violent jerk that nearly dislocated her shoulders. She hung there, suspended by fingertips in terror, her boots scrabbling against the rock face, looking for something, anything to bear her weight. One boot found it, a stubborn root of a scrub bush growing from a crack. The plant held, its roots deeper than it had any right to be. The dislodged slab tumbled down the cliff, clattering and bouncing against the stone before smashing into pieces at the bottom. Clatter, crash, thud. The sound echoed through the valley, louder than a gunshot in the temporary lull of the firefight. It was the sound of a mistake, of exposure, of vulnerability. Kieran froze. She didn't breathe. She didn't blink. She pressed her face into the lichen-covered rock, trying to become part of the mountain itself, willing herself to be stone and shadow and nothing more. Below, the machine gun fire shifted. The enemy had heard the rockfall. They knew something was on the cliff. A line of bullets stitched across the rock face, searching. Puffs of pulverized stone erupted 10 feet to her right, then 10 feet to her left. They were reconnoitering by fire, shooting blindly to provoke movement. If she flinched, if she scrambled, if she even exhaled too hard, they would see it. The human eye is drawn to motion. It's hardwired into the predator brain. Millions of years of evolution hunting animals that run. So Kieran stopped being prey. She died, not literally but tactically. She surrendered to the uncomfortable position, accepting the agony as the price of invisibility. Her right leg was twisted at a bad angle, the knee torqued in a way that sent fire up her thigh. Her shoulder throbbed where she'd impacted the wall. The fingers holding her weight began to cramp, the muscles screaming for relief. Don't move. 5 minutes passed. The bullets stopped stitching the cliff face. The enemy grew bored, their attention drawn back to the compound where the SEALs were fighting for their lives. 10 minutes. Her leg went completely numb. The cramp in her fingers transformed into a knot of pure agony, but she locked it away in a box in her mind, a mental compartment where pain went to be ignored. 20 minutes. The sun had set hours ago, but the darkness deepened as the moon crossed behind the peaks. This was her ally. In the deeper shadow, she would be harder to see. Finally, when she was certain no one was watching, she moved her pinky finger. Just that, testing whether her body still obeyed commands. The finger moved. Then her wrist. Then her neck, slowly turning to look upward. The shelf was still 30 meters away. "Vance?" Brennan's voice was barely a whisper, afraid to speak louder lest he give her away. "You still with us?" "Moving," she replied, her voice a dry croak. She resumed the climb. This time she didn't rush. She moved with the agonizing slowness of a glacier, testing every hold twice before committing weight. Every step was silent, every movement deliberate. She became the mountain, patient and inevitable. She reached the shelf as the valley below descended into deeper darkness. It was a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for a prone body, hidden behind a screen of dry sagebrush that somehow managed to grow from the barren rock. She pulled herself over the lip and rolled onto her back, staring up at the stars appearing in the violet sky. Her lungs heaved, sucking in the thin air at 8,000 feet. Every muscle in her body trembled with exhaustion. She wanted to lie there forever, to close her eyes and let the cold take her into sleep. Thump. The sound from the valley below reminded her why she was here. She rolled onto her stomach, dragging the TAC-50 around. Her hands were shaking so badly, it took 3 tries to deploy the bipod legs. She settled them into the dirt, adjusting until the rifle was level. She cleared the scope covers with numb fingers. She brought the optic to her eye and looked across the valley. The angle had changed. She was no longer looking up from the valley floor. She was nearly parallel to the enemy sniper's position, maybe 20 meters lower in elevation, but on a horizontal plane. The geometry was different now. She scanned the dark fissure where the ghost was hiding. From this new angle, the loophole wasn't a black void anymore. She could see into the shadow, see the depth of the cave. There, deep inside, barely visible, was the heat signature of a rifle barrel resting on a tripod. Behind it, a glowing red shape hunched over the stock, the shooter. And behind him, barely visible, another signature, smaller, holding what looked like binoculars, a spotter. But then she saw something else. Behind the spotter, stacked against a cave wall, were rectangular shapes that glowed faintly on thermal. Ammo crates, explosives. This wasn't just a sniper hide, it was a fortified munitions cache. "Chief," Kieran whispered, her finger taking up the slack on the trigger. "I found him, but he brought friends. It's not just a hide, it's a supply point. I count at least 6 crates of ordnance back there. Can you take the shot?" Brennan's voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a man who knew he was asking her to do something nearly impossible. A fresh gust tore across the ledge. The wind was a crosswind, full value, at least 20 miles per hour, the nightmare scenario for long-range shooting. She would have to account for drift, elevation, the Coriolis effect at this latitude, and she would have to do it with a scope that had been slammed against rocks for the past hour. She adjusted her elevation dial. Click, click, click. She didn't have a wind meter. She didn't have a ballistic computer. She had a broken body and a rifle held together by determination. She watched the mirage through the scope, the heat waves from the day's warmth still radiating from the rocks, despite the falling temperature. The boil was moving right to left. The wind was gusting high, then dying, then gusting again. She needed to time the shot for the lull. "Target is static," she whispered to herself, seeing the enemy sniper settle in behind his rifle. "He doesn't know I'm here." She reached up and dialed in the correction, trusting instinct and experience more than math. The variables were too many, too complex. This was beyond calculation. This required faith in the fundamentals. In the thousands of hours she'd spent behind a rifle, learning to read conditions that couldn't be measured. She closed her eyes for 1 second, feeling the air on her cheek, listening to the sound of the wind, opening herself to the mountain. She opened her eyes and watched the enemy spotter. He raised his binoculars, scanning the valley floor, looking for targets. He pointed at the compound. The sniper settled in, preparing to fire another wall banger through the mud brick to kill the men sheltering inside. Wait. The wind roared in her ears, tearing through the sagebrush, making the rifle shift on its bipod. Wait. Then, as inexplicably as it had risen, the wind died. The sage stopped dancing. The dust hanging in the air suspended in a moment of perfect stillness, like the world taking a breath. Now. She didn't pull the trigger. She squeezed it, a steady increase of pressure straight back, letting the break surprise her even though she knew it was coming. Crack. The rifle slammed into her shoulder with brutal force. The muzzle brake vented fire and gas to the sides, the concussion echoing off the cliff face. The recoil broke her sight picture, the scope jerking upward. She fought the rifle back down immediately, her eye hunting for the impact. At 1,250 meters, the bullet's time of flight was nearly 2 full seconds. 2 seconds in which the Earth rotated, the wind shifted, and physics played out its eternal equations. Through the scope, she saw the trace, the visual disturbance in the air caused by the supersonic shockwave. It looked like a tunnel of distorted reality arcing through space, dropping toward the dark fissure. The trace disappeared into the shadow. For a microsecond, nothing happened. Then the heat signature of the enemy sniper simply unraveled. There was no cinematic explosion, no dramatic death scene. The red shape jerked violently backward as if yanked by an invisible cable, then slumped sideways and disappeared behind the rock wall. Hit. The spotter froze. He stared at the space where his partner had been sitting 1 second ago. He didn't understand, yet. The bullet had traveled faster than sound. He hadn't heard the shot. He just saw his teammate cease to exist. Then the sound arrived. Thump. The crack of Kieran's rifle, delayed by distance and the speed of sound, echoed across the valley. The spotter scrambled backward, dropping his binoculars, diving deeper into the cave, his heat signature disappearing into the darkness. "Target down," Kieran said into her radio. Her voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of someone reporting a fact. She waited for the rush of triumph, the surge of adrenaline, the feeling that the movies promised when you made an impossible shot. Nothing came, just cold stone under her stomach and the ringing in her ears. She had just ended a life from 3/4 of a mile away, and she felt as detached as if she'd just completed a spreadsheet. That emptiness scared her more than the return fire. "Echo Actual, this is Sierra 1, she radioed, using her official call sign. "Primary threat neutralized. The wall banger is dead." There was a pause on the line, a long, static-filled silence. "Say again, Sierra 1, Brennan's voice came back, winded and incredulous. "You got him?" Affirmative. Center mass. Threat is down. Vance, Brennan breathed, and she heard something in his voice she'd never heard before. Awe. That was over 1,200 meters, in variable wind, at night, with gear that's been beat to hell. Wind died down for a second, Kieran lied. The wind hadn't died. Check fire. We have a lull. Reload and check fire. We have a lull. Reload and reorganize. Doc, how's Breaker? Stable, the medic's voice replied, tight with stress. But he needs surgery. We need to move him soon or we're going to lose the leg. Kieran cycled the bolt of her rifle. The massive brass casing spun out, tumbling through the air before landing on the rock next to her face. It was still hot, the heat searing her cold cheek. She didn't move it. The pain was grounding, proof that she was still real. Sierra 1, hold your position, Brennan ordered. Scan for secondaries. If he had a spotter, there might be more up there. Copy, Kieran said, settling back behind the scope. She shifted her gaze back to the cave. The spotter was gone, vanished into the depths. But the ammo crates were still there, glowing faintly on thermal. She had killed the shooter, but the gun was still there. The ammunition was still there. And wars weren't won by men anymore. They were won by logistics, by supply chains, by the ability to sustain violence longer than your enemy. Chief, Kieran said slowly, an idea forming. I see munitions in that cave, multiple crates. This wasn't a sniper hide, it's a supply dump. Can you destroy it? Kieran looked at her magazine. She had loaded M33 ball ammunition, standard full metal jacket rounds. Great for accuracy, useless for creating explosions. But she had one magazine of MK211 Raufoss rounds in her chest rig, the multi-purpose ammunition that combined armor-piercing, incendiary, and explosive effects in a single package. The do-everything round that cost $40 per trigger pull. She reached for her magazine pouch with trembling fingers. Stand by, she said. I'm going to light a fire. She dropped the magazine from the rifle. The metallic click sounded impossibly loud in the returning silence. She pulled the Raufoss magazine from her pouch, the rounds visibly different from standard ball ammunition, the tips painted with color codes that designated their lethal capabilities. She fed the new magazine into the well and chambered a round. Somewhere out there in the dark, there were bad men doing bad things. And somewhere, someone needed her to be the person who stopped them. The silence following the enemy sniper's death was a lie. It was the calm that comes after the first wave, the moment when both sides pause to assess damage and reload weapons, and wonder if survival is a possibility. But Kieran knew better than to trust it. Silence in war wasn't peace. It was just violence holding its breath. Echo 1, we are moving. Brennan's voice crackled through the static. Breaking contact, heading for the wadi on the south side of the compound. Keep our heads down, Vance. Copy, Chief. I have the sector. Through her scope, she watched the thermal signatures of the SEAL team spill out of the battered compound. They moved with aggressive fluidity despite their wounds, dragging Breaker between them on an improvised litter made from cargo straps and rifle slings. They were dark shapes against a gray world, sprinting toward the dry riverbed that would offer them cover from the high ground. But the enemy was not retreating. They were adapting. From the maze of mud brick structures to the east, heat signatures began flooding into the open ground. But these weren't the sharp, aggressive movements of fighters advancing to contact. These were erratic, stumbling shapes, small ones, civilians, women in long chadris and children, herded out of their homes like cattle, pushed into the street with rifle butts and shouted threats. Kieran could see them through thermal, their bodies bright white against the cooling earth, arms raised, moving in the confused patterns of terrified people who didn't understand why their homes had become a battlefield. And moving behind them, using them as a living wall, were the insurgents. Men with RPG launchers and machine guns, advancing under cover of human shields. Chief, you have movement from the east, Kieran warned, her finger hovering over the trigger guard. Multiple contacts, maybe 20, but they're mixed. I repeat, they are mixed with non-combatants. How close? Brennan's voice was tight, the sound of a man running while carrying wounded. 100 meters in closing. They're pushing the civilians toward your route, using them as cover. The SEALs reached the edge of the wadi, dropping into the cover of the ditch. But the ditch was a trap if the enemy could get close enough. Drop a grenade into it, throw in a satchel charge, and the narrow confines would turn the blast into a meat grinder. Kieran tracked a group of 3 men moving behind a cluster of women and children. The thermal image showed the children clearly, small, bright shapes clinging to their mother's clothing. And behind them, barely visible, the cooler signatures of weapons. The men were carrying RPG launchers, using the women's flowing robes to mask the tubes. They stopped behind a low stone wall. One of the men knelt, using a woman's shoulder as a rest for the launcher tube. Kieran could see him adjusting his aim, lining up the shot toward the wadi where Brennan's team was sheltering. RPG team setting up, Kieran said, her voice tight. Sector 3, behind the well. They're using human shields. I do not have a clean line. Take them out, Vance, Brennan yelled. The sound of AK-47 fire erupted from another direction as the SEALs engaged a different threat. They're lining up on our position, Kieran centered the crosshairs. The magnification was high enough that she could see individual details. A child, maybe 6 years old, clinging to a woman's leg. The woman standing perfectly still, frozen by fear or resignation. And the insurgent behind them, his face obscured but his body language confident. He knew the Americans wouldn't shoot. He knew the rules of engagement better than they did. He was weaponizing their morality. The physics of the shot were simple. Center of mass on the insurgent, 1,200 meters. The wind was calmer now. She had the solution. The ethics were impossible. If she fired, the .50 caliber round would pass through the insurgent. But the hydrostatic shock, the pressure wave created by a bullet that size passing through human tissue, was lethal within inches. And if she missed by even a fraction, if the bullet deviated by a single degree, Vance, now, Tex's voice cut through, raw and desperate. He's lining up the shot. She watched the insurgent pull the trigger on the RPG. There was no more time for debate, no more space for philosophy. Whoosh! The rocket streaked across the open ground, leaving a trail of gray smoke against the dark sky. It slammed into the lip of the wadi right where Brennan and the medic were crouching. Boom! The explosion threw dirt and rock high into the air, a geyser of earth and fire. Man down! Man down! Chief is hit. Kieran saw it through her scope. Brennan's heat signature, blown backward by the blast, crumpling against the dirt bank. He wasn't moving. Chief! The word tore from her throat, animal and raw. The insurgent was reloading. He grabbed another rocket from the pack carried by the man beside him, already lining up the second shot. The woman and child were still standing there, frozen in place, shields that couldn't run even if they wanted to. The detachment that had protected her, the mathematical distance she'd maintained, collapsed completely. In its place, something cold and necessary took over. She didn't aim for the insurgent's chest. That was too close to the woman. She shifted her point of aim to the RPG warhead itself, the explosive charge protruding from the front of the launcher tube. It was a 1 in a million shot, a gamble with physics and fate. The target was maybe 4 inches in diameter, moving slightly as the man adjusted his aim. Forgive me, she whispered. Not to God, not to the woman and child who might die, to the person she used to be, the one who believed there were clean choices in war. She fired. Crack. The bullet crossed the valley in a heartbeat, following a ballistic arc calculated by instinct more than math. It struck the RPG warhead just as the insurgent was lifting it to his shoulder. The warhead didn't detonate fully. The safety arming distance hadn't been reached yet. But the kinetic impact of a 750-grain bullet traveling at 2,700 feet per second shattered the propellant charge and the explosive fill. The RPG disintegrated in a violent flash, a fireball that engulfed the insurgent. The blast knocked a woman and child forward, face first, into the dirt. They lay still. Kieran didn't know if they were dead. She didn't know if shrapnel had torn through their bodies, or if the overpressure had simply rendered them unconscious. The thermal image couldn't tell her. She could only see that they weren't moving. She racked the bolt, ejecting the spent Roth's casing. Her hands moved on autopilot, muscle memory taking over while her conscious mind tried to process what she'd just done. "Threat neutralized," she said, her voice unrecognizable to her own ears. It was dead, robotic, the voice of someone who'd crossed a line and couldn't see the way back. "Chief is down!" The medic's voice was frantic, crackling with static and fear. "Shrapnel to the neck and shoulder, heavy bleeding. We need to move now or he's going to bleed out." "Vance!" Tex called, his voice shaking in a way she'd never heard before. The cocky sniper from the range was gone, replaced by someone young and scared and looking for salvation. "Clear us a path. Kill everything that isn't us. Do you copy? Everything." Kieran looked through the scope at the chaos below. The civilians were scattering now, running in all directions, the spell of control broken by the explosion. The insurgents were exposed, visible, targetable. "Copy," she heard herself say. She settled the crosshairs on the next target. A man with a PKM machine gun, running toward a new firing position. She didn't hesitate, didn't think about whether he had a family, whether he was fighting for belief, or money, or coercion. Boom! He dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Rack the bolt, find the next target. A man with an AK-47 firing from behind a wall. Boom! The wall erupted in dust. The firing stopped. Rack the bolt, next target. Two men carrying an ammunition crate between them. Boom! The crate exploded in a secondary blast. Both men vanished. She began to fire rhythmically, methodically. Not a sniper anymore, but something else. A machine. A reaper. The harvest had begun, and she was pitiless in her efficiency. Boom! Rack! Boom! Rack! The enemy broke. The psychological impact of taking casualties from an invisible source, from a distance they thought was safe, shattered their cohesion. They began to run, abandoning their weapons, fleeing back into the maze of buildings. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Brennan's voice, weak and wet but alive. "Vance, cease fire, they're running." Kieran's finger froze on the trigger. She was tracking another target, a man sprinting away. Her brain had already calculated the lead, the drop, the wind. She could kill him. It would be easy. She lifted her finger from the trigger. "Sierra 1, ceasing fire," she reported, her voice hollow. But staying alive meant staying useful. Kieran dragged herself back from the ledge, her body protesting every movement. The scope was functional, but the rifle had taken a beating. She needed better optics if this night was going to continue. She spotted him 20 meters down the slope, separated from the main fighting. An insurgent scout moving along the perimeter, carrying an AK-74 with what looked like a thermal optic mounted on the rail. Expensive Russian hardware. Kieran set down her rifle and drew her K-bar knife. Her body screamed protest as she rose to a crouch. The scout was focused on the compound, hadn't seen her yet. She closed the distance in 4 seconds. Her left arm snaked around his throat, knife driving upward under the jaw. It was wet. It was warm. It was horrific in its intimacy. The scout thrashed, his hands clawing at her arm. They fell together into the dirt, wrestling in silence. He was stronger, heavier, but she had surprise and desperation. She twisted the blade, felt the resistance give way to something softer, wetter. He went limp. The weight of him was suffocating. Kieran pushed him off, gasping. She'd killed from distance before. This was different. This was feeling his heartbeat stop against her chest, feeling the heat leave his body. She took his thermal optic with shaking hands, grabbed duct tape from her kit. 10 minutes of jury rigging in the dark, and she had a hybrid sight. her cracked scope backed up by the Russian thermal unit taped to the rifle's Picatinny rail. It was ugly. It was asymmetric. It worked. Sierra 1 to Echo, she whispered. Optic repaired. I'm back in the fight. Echo 1, we have a problem. Tex's voice cut through, thin with fear. Heavy weapon moving down the valley. ZP-U-2 anti-aircraft gun on a technical. If it reaches firing position, we're done. Kieran scanned through her makeshift optic. There, a Toyota pickup bouncing over rough terrain. Twin-barreled AA gun mounted in the bed. 2,300 meters away and closing. The math was insane. At that distance, bullet flight time would be over 4 seconds. The truck was moving at 40 miles per hour. She'd have to lead the target by 50 meters, shooting at empty space and trusting physics. And her shoulder was already destroyed from the previous shots. I see it, Kieran said. Range 2,400. Can you hit it? Brennan asked, his voice barely a whisper now. The medic was working on his neck wound, packing it with combat gauze. Kieran didn't answer. She was doing calculations that her concussed brain couldn't hold. Muzzle velocity, trajectory arc, Coriolis effect at this latitude. The numbers slipped through her mind like water. Stop, she told herself. Stop thinking. She watched the truck, felt the wind, opened herself to instinct built from 10,000 practice rounds. She aimed at darkness 3 football fields ahead of the moving vehicle. Exhale. The trigger brake surprised her. Boom. The recoil was catastrophic. Her already damaged shoulder joint tore completely free of the socket. With a wet pop, she felt more than heard. The pain was white-hot, blinding, absolute. She screamed into the dirt, a sound she'd never made before. 4.5 seconds later, 1,200 meters downrange, a 750-grain bullet traveling at 2,600 feet per second struck the engine block of the Toyota. The truck didn't explode. It died. The engine seized instantly, locking the front wheels. At 40 miles per hour, the physics were unforgiving. The vehicle cartwheeled forward, the gunner in back ejected like a rag doll, the twin barrels of the ZPU-2 carving a trench in the earth. Secondary explosion. Fuel tank. The truck bloomed into orange flame. Target destroyed, Kieran gasped, her right arm hanging useless, dislocated. Tears froze on her cheeks. Target destroyed. Holy, Tex's voice was pure disbelief. Vance, did you just... Don't, Kieran cut him off. Don't make it more than it was. But it was more. They both knew it. She just made a shot that violated the laws of probability and redefined the possible. And it had cost her everything she had left. The enemy wasn't done. Through her thermal sight, Kieran watched heat signatures massing for a final assault on the Wadi. 50, maybe 60 fighters, moving with purpose. They'd learned their lesson about standing in the open. Now they came low and fast. Echo 1, this is Havoc, a new voice on comms. We have fast movers inbound. F-16 with full payload, but pilot needs laser designation. Can you laze the target? Negative, Tex replied. We're in a ditch. Can't get eyes up without getting our heads blown off. Silence on the net. The kind of silence that precedes death. Kieran looked at the PE Q-15 IR laser designator mounted to her rifle. She looked at the valley floor. She did the math. The F-16's GBU-38 had a blast radius of 250 meters for fragmentation. She was 180 meters from where the enemy was massing, well within the kill zone. Viper 1, this is Sierra 1, she transmitted on the air support frequency. I can laze. I have clear line of sight to target concentration. Sierra 1, confirm you are outside the frag zone, the pilot responded, professional and clipped. Kieran looked at her dislocated arm, her shattered body, the blood soaking through her uniform from a dozen small wounds she hadn't noticed. Affirmative, she lied. I'm clear. Run in from the south. Look for the sparkle. She had to get above the ridgeline. had to expose herself to enemy fire to paint the target. One arm was useless. She used the other to drag herself up onto the rocks, pushed the rifle into position with her cheek and her one good hand. Below, insurgents were sprinting toward the wadi. 20 seconds until they reached grenade range. Kieran activated the laser. An infrared beam, invisible to the naked eye, lanced out toward the center of the enemy formation. Through the pilot's sensors, it would appear as a bright sparkle of coherent light. Immediately, every fighter with night vision saw the beam trace back to her position. "I see the sparkle," Viper 1 announced. 10 seconds. Stand by. Machine gun fire raked Kieran's position. PKM rounds chewed the rock face, throwing stone chips into her face. A bullet tugged her sleeve. Another sparked off the rifle's barrel. She didn't move. If she moved the laser, the bomb would miss. If the bomb missed, Team Echo would die. 5 seconds. Blood ran into her eye from a cut on her forehead. She blinked it away, held the laser steady. 3, 2, 1, weapon away. Kieran heard it before she saw it, a tearing sound, like canvas being ripped by a giant. The GBU-38 fell down the wire of light she was holding, a 500-pound hammer of precision-guided death. "Danger close," she whispered. "Danger." Crack, boom. The detonation was biblical. The earth didn't shake, it convulsed. The shockwave hit Kieran like a physical wall, lifting her off the ground, slamming her into the rocks behind her. The overpressure squeezed her chest, stopped her heart for a beat. Debris rained from the sky, rocks, metal, dirt, things that had been men. Her ears shut down completely, protecting her brain from permanent damage. The world became silent film, all visuals and no sound. She lay there, covered in dust, her hands still gripping the rifle, the laser still active, painting a crater that glowed white-hot on thermal. Echo 1. Echo 1 status. The pilot's voice was distant, muffled, like speaking through water. Static. "Please," Kieran thought, "please say something." Click, click. A squelch break on the radio. Then Brennan's voice, wet and ragged but impossibly alive. We're still here. Dust is heavy, but we're breathing." Kieran let her head fall back against the stone. A sob escaped, then another. Not fear, not pain. Relief so profound it hurt worse than her wounds. "Good copy, Echo," the pilot said, his professional calm cracking slightly. "That was danger close to the meter. Whoever was on that laser, tell them they have balls of titanium." Kieran tried to respond, but her body finally quit. The adrenaline that had kept her functioning evaporated. The darkness at the edges of her vision rushed in like a tide. Her last conscious thought, "They're alive, that's enough." The world went black. Consciousness returned as sound, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of rotors beating air. Kieran's eyes opened to see the interior of a Chinook bathed in red tactical lighting. She was on a litter. Someone had immobilized her arm, started an IV. Hospital corpsman, second-class Alara Finch, was checking her vitals, her face tight with professional concern. Across the cargo bay, she could see Brennan, also on a litter, neck bandaged heavily, but his eyes were open, looking at her. Tech sat nearby, holding Kieran's TAC-50. The big wanted to tell them she was just doing her job, that anyone would have done the same. But her throat wouldn't work, so she just nodded back. The Chinook banked hard, climbing for altitude. Through the open ramp, she could see the Hindu Kush falling away beneath them. The valley where she'd become something other than a girl, where she'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Somewhere down there, a woman and child lay in the dirt. She didn't know if they were alive or dead. She'd probably never know. That uncertainty would haunt her forever. Brennan managed to turn his head toward her despite the neck wound. His lips moved. The rotor noise was too loud to hear, but she read the words. "Thank you." She closed her eyes. Let the vibration of the helicopter carry her away from the mountain, away from the choices, away from everything except the simple fact of survival. But she knew the truth. You could leave the mountains behind. The mountains never left you. 48 hours later, Kieran sat in a white room that smelled of antiseptic and lies. Her arm was in a heavy sling, shoulder joint reduced and stabilized. 3 cracked ribs taped, lacerations sutured, concussion monitored. The doctors said she'd heal. They didn't understand that some things don't. Across the table sat Commander Dennis Sterling, crisp and clean in a uniform that had never seen combat. He smelled of coffee and printer toner. Brennan entered in a wheelchair pushed by a corpsman. His neck was bandaged, his leg in a cast. But his eyes were the same hard, blue flint. "Don't sign anything, Vance," Brennan said immediately, his voice still damaged but fierce. "Don't you sign a goddamn thing until they put the commendation in writing." Sterling sighed like a parent dealing with a difficult child. "Master Chief, we've discussed this. The optics are problematic." "Optics?" Brennan's hands clenched the wheelchair's armrests. "She saved the entire element, killed a sniper at 1250, stopped a technical at 2400. That's a record. That's a Navy Cross minimum." "It's a political nightmare," Sterling corrected, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We cannot have a press release stating that a Tier 1 SEAL element was pinned down and rescued by a 19-year-old female support attachment. Do you understand what that does? It undermines the deterrence value of the unit. It embarrasses the Department of Defense. It raises questions we cannot answer." Kieran looked at the folder. She could see the typed report upside down. Her eyes picked out key phrases. "Target neutralization credited to Echo Element Collective Action. Vehicle destruction attributed to air support, GBU 38 strike. Sniper elimination, unconfirmed." They were erasing her. Not out of malice, out of bureaucratic necessity. The legend of the SEALs had to be maintained. They were the invincible demigods. They couldn't be saved by a girl from Appalachia with a duct-taped rifle. "This is horse shit," Brennan growled. "I will go to the Admiral. I will testify. I'll make sure—" "And if you do," Sterling interrupted, steel entering his voice, "the investigation into your Broken Arrow call will be reopened. You requested Ordnance Danger Close in violation of standing ROE. You expose your team to friendly fire. You made tactical decisions under extreme duress that under scrutiny could be considered reckless endangerment." He leaned forward. "Your pension is gone, Master Chief. Your service record is tarnished. And Corporal Vance faces a court-martial for unauthorized use of a laser designator in a civilian area. Charges: reckless endangerment, potential war crimes if those civilians died." The room went silent. The threat was naked and absolute. Brennan froze. He looked at Kieran, his expression crumbling. He'd been ready to sacrifice his career for her. But Sterling had just put her career on the chopping block too. Kieran stood. The chair scraped loudly against linoleum. She walked to the table, picked up the pen. "Vance," Brennan whispered, "you don't have to." "It doesn't matter, Chief," Kieran said softly. She looked at him, and for the first time since the extraction, she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the tired, knowing smile of a veteran. "I know what I did. You know. The guys know. That's enough." She signed her name at the bottom of the NDA. Clean, steady, no hesitation. Kieran J. Vance, CPL, USMC. Sterling took the folder, sliding it into his briefcase. "You are reassigned to Bagram Support Battalion, effective immediately, pending rotation back to the States. Dismissed." "No," Kieran said. Sterling paused. "Excuse me? I don't want to rotate home. Put me on the roster for the next mission cycle. I want to stay in theater." Brennan's eyes widened. "Vance, go home. Go to college. Get away from this. You've done enough." Kieran looked at her reflection in the darkened window. She saw someone different than the girl who'd arrived 2 weeks ago. That girl had believed in clean choices and righteous wars. This person knew better. "I'm good at this," Kieran said simply, "and the mountains are quiet." She walked to the door, stopped by Brennan's wheelchair. She reached out with her good hand and touched his shoulder. "See you around, Grave," she whispered, using his call sign for the first time. Brennan looked up at her. Tears stood in his eyes. He nodded once. A salute given without a hand raised. Kieran walked out of the room, into the hallway, through the double doors, out into the Afghan night. The air smelled the same as it had in the valley, diesel and dust. The runway lights stretched into darkness. Somewhere out there, bad men were doing bad things. Somewhere, someone needed a ghost. She wasn't a hero. Heroes got medals and parades and their names in newspapers. She was something else. She was the needle. Sharp, invisible, necessary. And the war had plenty of wounds that needed stitching. 6 months later, different mountains, same war. Kieran lay prone on a different ridge, in a different province, with a different team. The TAC-50 had been replaced with a new one, but she'd kept the old cracked scope as a reminder. Through her optics, she watched a target 900 meters downrange. Routine overwatch, nothing special. Her radio crackled with cross-chatter from another frequency, someone mentioning the ghost of the Hindu Kush, a legend growing despite official silence, a sniper who'd made impossible shots, a phantom who saved SEAL teams and vanished. They didn't know it was a 19-year-old girl. They'd never know. Kieran smiled slightly and adjusted her scope. 1,200 miles away, Master Chief Thaddeus Brennan sat in a coffee shop in San Diego. Across from him sat a young woman with his eyes, his daughter, Moira. 19 years old. They hadn't spoken in 3 years. "I'm glad you called, Dad," Moira said quietly. "I missed you." Brennan's throat tightened. "I missed you too, kiddo, more than you know." "What changed? Why reach out now?" Brennan thought about a girl on a mountain, holding a laser under fire, saving lives at the cost of her own innocence. "I knew someone your age," he said carefully. "She taught me something important. She taught me that it's never too late to be the person you're supposed to be, never too late to make things right." "What happened to her?" Moira asked. Brennan looked out the window at the California sun, thinking of Hindu Kush darkness. "She's still out there," he said, being exactly who she was born to be. Back in Afghanistan, Kieran's target moved. She tracked him through the scope, calculated range, wind, drop. Her finger rested on the trigger, steady, patient, ready. "I see you," she whispered. The mountains had called her home, and she'd answered. Some debts can only be paid in service. Some wars never really end.